Hello and welcome to the NEGOTIATex podcast. My name is Nolan Martin. With me, as always, Aram Denisian. Aram, you want to kick it off for today?
I will. I can't tell you how excited I am, Nolan, for today's guest. This has been in the works for months, and her very busy schedule, rightly so, is making time for us. We're very excited to have Damali Peterman on the program today. Damali Peterman is a highly regarded and sought-after lawyer, mediator, negotiator, educator, and speaker with 20 years of experience in the field of alternative dispute resolution. She is the founder and CEO of two successful award-winning companies, Breakthrough ADR and Damali Law, and is the author of Negotiating While Black, Be Who You Are to Get What You Want. Damali has a bachelor's in English with a minor in Spanish and a master's in international policy studies with a focus in conflict resolution. She earned her Juris Doctorate from Howard University School of Law. Damali has also studied in Mexico, Denmark, Japan, and the Netherlands. Prior to attending law school, Damali was the community outreach coordinator and the assistant director of an environmental and community-focused nonprofit in Costa Rica. She also taught international negotiation, economics, and politics during a summer term for the Global Young Leaders Program in Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Washington, D.C., and New York. Damali is a member of the board of directors of the New York Peace Institute, one of the largest civilian peacekeeping centers in the nation, helping more than 10,000 people resolve their conflicts each year. When Damali isn't focused on building a worldwide community of conflict resolvers, she enjoys playing volleyball, reading, traveling, and finding creative ways to make her friends and family laugh. Damali, thank you for joining us today.
Aram, Nolan, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, as a fellow spouse and parent, I have to ask, which do you find more difficult? Getting your family members and friends to laugh or handling the very wide range of negotiations that you are regularly involved in?
That's a great question. I have to say that I studied improv at the Upright Citizens Brigade. And so because of that, I've had some help in training and trying to get my family to laugh. My husband thinks I'm hilarious. My oldest son is a tween, so not much that I say is funny to him. And in fact, he told me the other day, Mom, that's so 2020. And I was like, what? It was just a few years ago. That's so 2020. And my youngest son, he also thinks that I'm hilarious too. Some might say he's my favorite.
I find that as they get a little older, you got to cherish those younger moments, right? Because they kind of take us a little more lightly. As they get into those teen years, it gets a little more tricky.
This is so true. But of course, negotiating, it's an art, right? Some would say it's an art and a science. I think it's an art, more of an art than a science. I've had some negotiations that I thought would be extremely challenging that weren't, because I was able to build rapport and trust relatively quickly, or it was already pre-existing. I've had some negotiations that had a lot of surprises that I was not anticipating. And so it really depends. But I think I'm equally as funny as I am skilled at negotiating.
Well, let me know when you write your next book on negotiating with tweens and teens. I want to be the first one to buy that.
I have to interview you. It sounds like you have some expertise.
In a week, we'll have 3 teens in the house. So, yeah.
You should book, Aram. Not me. I don't even have a teen. I have a tween.
Well, Damali, reflecting on the experiences of the past 20 years, are there any key moments that significantly impacted how you think about your approach to negotiation today? And who are your heroes that have helped pave the path you're on?
Oh, I love this question so much. There are so many negotiations that I think were key moments. There are 3 that I would probably share because I think they cover sort of a breadth of the different types of negotiations. One, I will say a professional negotiation that I had. Little known fact, at the time I was 13 weeks pregnant. I was abroad in a conference room. I was the only woman. I was the only Black woman. I was one of 2 Americans in the room. During that negotiation, they just kept negotiating. I think we got there at 9 a.m. and they kept going and going and going. And lunchtime came and lunchtime went. And I literally was sitting there thinking, I'm nailing this negotiation, but I think I'm kind of struggling as a soon-to-be parent because I haven't had any food and no one, I don't know if this is a negotiation tactic to starve the negotiators, but it's working. But I felt like I had a responsibility, of course, to my unborn child to take care of him as well. And so the next day, when I ordered breakfast at the hotel, I also asked for lunch to go. And when I arrived there that day, I asked the assistant who greeted us if she would put my lunch in the refrigerator, and that when I wrote her, if she would, bring it out. So of course, lunchtime comes, no one even talks about lunch. Everyone's sort of posturing, if you will, like who's going to show that they're hungry first. We are not robots. We are people. People need sustenance. We need to eat. But no one wanted to break the moment first. So I sent her an email and I asked her if she would bring lunch to me. Do you know she took it to another level? She brought it on a tray. There was a glass of ice and Coke and water. She brought everything out there. And everyone was just sort of like, where did the lunch come from? And where did she get lunch? And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, gentlemen. I noticed we didn't eat lunch yesterday and I need to have lunch in the middle of the day. I still didn't tell them that I was pregnant at the time, but I need to have lunch in the middle of the day. I'm sorry. I'm happy to share. It was like a chicken salad. I'm happy to share. No one wanted to share. The next day is day 3 of the negotiations. Everyone brought something. One guy had a tuna packet, the one that you sort of can mix with crackers. Someone else had some chips. And then on the 4th day, the hosts felt so bad that they gave us breakfast, lunch, dinner. There were snacks in between.
Wow.
And so to me, that was an interesting negotiation because the content of what we're discussing, it was a cross-border transaction. I won't say too many details to reveal who those not so great hosts were, but it was many negotiations happening at once, right? It was a negotiation that was the reason that we were there for the merger, and it was also an acquisition that was happening. There was a negotiation that I was having with myself, essentially, is to say, what is important to me? How am I being true to myself and my values as a human who needs to eat, and also as a person who needs to care for someone who can't care for themselves at 13 weeks? And then also how I impacted the negotiations, essentially changing the way that the hosts were hosting us and people recognizing that this tactic of trying to starve us wasn't going to work. So that one, I think, is very important because it also kind of shows how our different identities can be in conflict in a negotiation. Mine as a senior associate and negotiator, mine as a person just who needs to eat, and also as a future parent, right? All of those were in conflict at some point, and I found a way to move forward. Another negotiation that was impactful is one that you can relate to, given the fact that we are talking about negotiating with teens or tweens or trying to get our family members to laugh. I'm the oldest of 7 children, gentlemen, the oldest of 7. So I was sort of in the middle of my parents and my siblings. And I learned at an early age that advocacy was about what you shared and how you shared it, right? And so I could see I had many opportunities to test, and when the stakes were low, if you will, different strategies, even before I had my first negotiations class, because I was trying to influence people who were older and smarter and wiser than me, and also influence people who were coming after me to help them, right? I would sometimes help myself too. I was the oldest, right? Some might say I was a little bossy. Some might say that. But that was also very important, life-changing negotiations for me, because if you can imagine 8 people with different personalities and trying to see what worked and what didn't work. And then finally, I think the last negotiation that I would share, which I think encompasses everything, is the negotiations that I encountered for my book. My book went to auction in the US and the UK. And even though my proposal was for a negotiations book, I had to negotiate every aspect of my book, which turned out well, but it just made me laugh because I'm like, wait, I'm not writing a book on, my favorite recipes. I'm writing a negotiations book, and then we're going to engage in negotiations. And I feel like I have somewhat of an unfair advantage, but we're going to move forward.
I love those 3 stories. One of the things that I will often ask my students to do is go back at the beginning of the term and just say, what's my natural approach to negotiation and how did it develop? And you hit on these 3 things, one very recent with the book, one a little further back in time as the oldest to 7. I have 6 kids, so I'll have to talk to my oldest, Ruth, and see if she can identify with the same sort of feeling like she's in the middle and needing to advocate. I want to come back at some point too, by the way, Damali, and the how, right? Not only what we advocate for, but how we do it. I'm sure we'll pull that out at some point. This other piece about the professional starvation tactic or whatever it was. But that's nice. It's such a nice, rich kind of explanation of how you've kind of formed your thinking around this topic we're discussing today. You're involved in so many different organizations and projects. I'm wondering if you can tell us just a little bit about each, especially beginning with the work that you do through your 2 companies, Breakthrough ADR and Damali Law.
Well, I'll tell you that Damali Law started first. So I worked for a big law firm for many years, a few of their different offices, New York, London, Shanghai, but primarily in New York. That was excellent. I had a wonderful experience there. And then I went to work for one of our clients in the Office of General Counsel. And I worked there for a few years, and something very similar to what's happening now was going on. So it was a presidential election year, and I really wanted to, one way to think of it is I wanted to sort of go back to my roots. I wanted to do more conflict de-escalation work. I had incorporated the tenets of conflict de-escalation and mediation and just dispute resolution in general into my practice as an attorney. And I think that was something very different if you consider law, as many do, to be more adversarial, especially because TV popularizes litigation, right? You have so many court programs, and I love all of them, but you see more of an adversarial view into the legal field. And I wanted to just go back to my roots. You know, you mentioned before that my master's degree is in international policy studies with a focus on conflict resolution. And so I just wanted to do more of that. In fact, that's why I went to law school. That's why I went to Howard University School of Law. We're trained to be social engineers, to give back and to help. Damali Law was my way at a very similar time as now in 2016 of saying, I think the world's going to need more conflict resolvers. Let me sort of focus on that. So I hung my own shingle. Damali Law started as a boutique law firm, and I opened the door with clients because people wanted, big law experience and services at boutique law prices, right? And when I started Damali Law, I knew I wanted to do that. And I also wanted to provide a consulting arm because I realized along the way that there are many opportunities for people to have resolved their conflict before they needed to get me involved as an attorney. And so how could I consult and be more preventative and proactive instead of really being reactive when people would come to me? And then the third part of it was going back to my roots in conflict resolution and saying, okay, you know what? I'm going to offer mediation and let's see what happens. Well, and not just mediation, but training. So more training. So there's a consulting arm, but then also the training arm, the educational arm. And what ended up happening a couple of years after I started Damali Law was the training arm grew so much that I had to give it its own identity, its own company. And that's why I started Breakthrough ADR. And at Breakthrough ADR, what we do is primarily focus on teaching people how to listen, negotiate, and resolve conflict in the workplace and beyond. And that was really amazing to see that transformation. And it was really transformational for me because I still see myself as an attorney. Of course, I'm an attorney. I'm practicing attorney. I'm still licensed to practice in the state of New York. And I think I will keep that until I can't write or read or speak anymore because it's a part of me. It's interesting how my roles have shifted, right? Because I was just traveling and everywhere that I went, everyone introduced me as the author of the best-selling book, Negotiating While Black. And that was kind of I don't know if it was a culture shock for me, but having most of my career being known as an attorney and then having the shift, of course, to being known as a mediator, arbitrator, and now walk into a room and the first thing that people say is Damali, the author. I think it's just amazing. So Breakthrough took on its own life. We were able to go global with our training programs, which is amazing. I do a lot of work now in different countries, working on court annex mediation programs, so helping mediators in various court systems, working with global organizations and kind of building up their conflict de-escalation arm and training their ombuds and their mediators. And as you can probably hear, I love it. I really enjoy having an impact on the way that conflict is resolved and disputes are just seen in general. And that's also why I teach mediation, which is essentially facilitated negotiations at Howard University School of Law.
You sound very busy, Damali. And I think kind of building upon that, you're even part of the President's Leadership Council of Searching Common Ground. And I think you have something there about JAMS. What are these and what's your role with both?
Well, let me first say that I also noticed that in the intro, you mentioned that I was on the board of the New York Peace Institute. I'm no longer on the board. I did serve for many years. As you stated, I am very busy, and so I'm no longer on the board. I am on the President's Leadership Council for the International Peace Building Powerhouse, Search for Common Ground. And Search for Common Ground is just an exceptional organization which really focuses on helping people globally find common ground. And I was so fortunate to be in Kigali, Rwanda during the week of the 30th commemoration of the unfortunate genocide there and take part in some of the progress and the recognition of where they are today. And while I was there, I was walking through the museum, the Genocide Museum, and there was an image, a photo of Search for Common Ground being there and helping and working on different aspects of the transformation of the country. And I see that many places where I travel. And so its presence is known. And so my work is essentially to listen, to share my network and expertise, and to learn. There are so many things that are happening globally, and Search for Common Ground is in the room. And I'm really fortunate that they asked me to be a part of the President's Leadership Council. With respect to JAMS, JAMS is also an exceptional dispute resolution private firm. It's invitation only. Our roster has about 420 or so neutrals. And for anyone who's listening who doesn't know the term, who is unfamiliar with the term neutral, it's just essentially a third party that's brought in to help resolve a matter. It could be a mediator, an arbitrator, a special evaluator, an ombuds, among other ways that we help individuals and organizations navigate and manage their conflict. I started working with JAMS about 3 years ago. I mediate and arbitrate exclusively for JAMS. And so essentially taking that arm out of Breakthrough ADR, I now do it exclusively for JAMS. And what I love about my work with JAMS is that it gives me an opportunity to really dive into the areas of law that I'm excited about. And so the types of cases that I handle run the gamut from employment to civil rights to commercial contract disputes, have entertainment cases, blockchain. How fun is cryptocurrency and blockchain? So I'm doing it because it's changing, right? It's new. It's constantly changing. And what I love about cryptocurrency and blockchain and all of that is that people who are just entering the legal field have an opportunity to learn and grow and catch up, right? It's the law isn't, I would say, in some areas, not as developed as some of the other areas of law. And so I really enjoy it. Recently, I was a part of a panel with two other gentlemen on cryptocurrency and blockchain and some of the new developments in the law. And I was very excited to be a part of the conversation because I was the person with the least amount of experience, meaning both gentlemen had worked in that area for much longer than me, but I had a lot to contribute to the discussion because I've been a player in the game for the last few years.
As you think about all this wide range of contexts that you have both negotiated and advised in, corporate to nonprofit, are there any of these contexts, do you find any of these contexts more challenging than others? And could you share an example of particularly difficult negotiation and what made it so difficult to manage?
It's the same skill set. So I don't think that there's a real difference between whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, because it's the same judgment, the same experience, the same skill set that you're bringing to the table as a negotiator, as a mediator, as an advisor, essentially. I think something that is really difficult is, of course, expectations, which are oftentimes the same, but managing expectations. Sometimes there may be some budgetary constraints, right? And no one, regardless of whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, no one wants to hear bad news, right? And so I think what's a challenging negotiation that I had was a merger and acquisition, but with a nonprofit. Because just imagine, and this could be for any organization, but just imagine that your corporate identity is being absorbed by another company. We see mergers and acquisitions happen on a regular basis. And sometimes the organization or company gets to keep their own identity and still be known as the name that they have. And sometimes they don't. And so I think something that's difficult in a negotiation is not really the information or the knowledge or the skills, but it's emotions, the people, how people feel, and navigating that. Where I see negotiators make a mistake is kind of having a poker face when someone is sharing something with you that, for whatever reason, objectively could be shocking to one's sensibilities. To me, that is a mistake. To see someone feeling angst or emotion or whatever fill in the blank it is, and to not say something, to not lean into it, I think it's a missed opportunity to form a connection, to build trust, and to really move the negotiation forward. A negotiation that was difficult was working with this organization. They were going through, it was a merger, but it was also an acquisition. They were losing their corporate identity, and the organization was started by family. And so their family's identity was also wrapped into the organization. And so helping them from a business perspective, everything was easy, right? We knew what to do. We knew what steps to do. We knew what we had to do in terms of what the state required, what was required by the federal government. We knew what to do, but it was navigating the people. It was navigating the emotions, the feelings, and trying to give them a new way to find purpose in the new structure, right? So do you want to stay on as consultants, able to relinquish this power or control to someone else? What is it that you want, and what is it that you need so that you feel as though this is successful? Not the dollars, the consideration that's being paid, but what do you need from a personal perspective to feel good about this transaction? And that's something that I found to be very challenging, because there were multiple people at the table and they all had different perspectives and different needs.
Why is it that we have such a hard time leaning into emotions? I mean, why do we put this mask, this poker face on? Any thoughts about why that happens?
A few things come to mind. One, cross-cultural communication. So oftentimes the way that we respond to a situation, and I've done a lot of research in this area, is influenced by many things. One is it could be influenced by your own education, exposure, environment, upbringing. I've had situations with people that say, guys don't cry. We don't show emotion. Okay, I've seen the opposite. I've heard the opposite too. I've been in situations where I've read a lot of studies, and also I've seen this, I believe, in several op-ed pieces and a few newspapers last year and this year, that women shouldn't apologize, right? It's showing a sign of weakness, or that people in a negotiation shouldn't apologize, right? And so I think that a lot of it is ingrained either into the individual based on how they were raised, so what their values are. It could be also the environment in general. So in this environment, we don't apologize. We always lead, with an iron fist, or whatever the case may be. It could also be the industry. Oftentimes we see every day in the news companies that have to share unfortunate information. And the question is, what should they do? Should the brand apologize? Should the brand own it? You see finger pointing. Is the CEO stepping down, or the president? What's happening? So I think there are a lot of things that go into how people communicate and how they communicate when there is a conflict. I'm sure you tell your students about Thomas Kilmann Initiative and talk about the 5 different ways that people respond when there's a conflict: competing, collaborating, avoiding, accommodating, and compromising, right? So there have been a lot of studies that show that those are the 5 primary ways that people respond when there's a conflict. But I think as humans, as human beings, if we go back to, what my grandmother would call the golden rule, and what many of us are familiar with as being the golden rule, sometimes we try to, I hope, treat people the way we want to be treated. And sometimes what that could mean is, I don't want anyone to, lean into, I'm not saying for me personally, but someone could think, well, I don't want anyone to sort of lean into it if I'm feeling sad or if I'm expressing emotion. But I think reality and the real world is that some sort of empathy has to be shown in the moment so that we can move forward. We can help the person who's showing the emotion move forward. If there's a heated discussion happening, acknowledging that this is very frustrating. This is, the emotions are running high, sort of leaning into it can also help to move the conversation along, especially if that heated discussion leads to impasse. So I think that some people are uncomfortable leaning into emotion. I think that some people are uncomfortable with emotion in general. I think that, as I mentioned before, there are a variety of reasons that could impact why one individual may have a specific response. But I think it's a missed opportunity. It's definitely a missed opportunity in a negotiation.
Thank you. You mentioned cross-cultural communication. You have worked all over the globe. You're fluent in Spanish. I believe you said you're conversationally fluent in Japanese. Pretty impressive. As you've worked globally across culture, are there lessons or guidelines that you've kind of, learned or developed for yourself when going into work outside your normal culture?
Certainly, I think a lot of this I sort of wrapped into something that I call the foundational five. And it's the five things that I think are essential or elements of every negotiation. And just to take a step back, to me, negotiation isn't just something that you do formally in a boardroom or when the stakes are high. Negotiation is a discussion that you may have with someone else or even with yourself. If you're asking yourself whether or not you're going to go to the gym this morning, like I did, or are you going to get some work done? That's a negotiation. And I won't tell you what I ended up doing. But I will say that to me, the negotiation, these five elements that I'm talking about, the foundational five, are present even when you're negotiating with yourself or you're negotiating with someone else, regardless of the stakes. And so the foundational five elements are five things you need to know. Know what you want, know what you need, know how to actively listen, know how to communicate, and know when to close. The reason that I'm using the foundational five to answer your question is because something that I've learned in cross-cultural communications is that it's important to listen first. Because if you listen first before you communicate, and listening isn't just the auditory approach of listening with your ears, but also taking in the environment, being observant, seeing what's going on around you, and sort of kind of falling into the cultural norm. So, for example, I've been to many countries. I think the last time I counted was over 50. And every time I go, if I'm going out to eat, I want to see what people are doing. I want to see how they're sitting. I want to kind of observe the norm. I'm just not going to do what I normally do. So I don't want to stand out even more than I'm already standing out, right? And so I want to sort of see, okay, everyone is going to say a prayer first. Okay, I'm going to do that too. Everyone is going to sit on the floor because that's what you do. I'm going to do that too. People are eating with their fingers. They're taking the bread and they're gathering the food. And I'm going to do that too. And so I think with cross-cultural communication, the best thing to do is to observe and to listen, and then to sort of figure out how to then adapt your communication style to what's going on in the broader world around you. And I think the challenge to that is sometimes people say, well, that's code switching, or that's not being authentic. No, I don't agree that that's code switching. I don't agree that that's not being authentic. Authenticity is not a substitute for being thoughtless. You still have to be thoughtful when you're presenting your authentic self, right? And everyone does this all the time. It's something that happens instinctively. So, if I'm talking to my young child, I'm going to talk to him. I may talk to him differently about a specific topic than I would with an adult, right? Who I'm assuming has more information, right, than my kid might have. And so I think that we do this instinctively. I remember when my youngest son was a baby and people would talk to him like in a baby voice. And I would say, you don't have to talk to him in a baby voice. You could still talk to him and say something that's, developmentally appropriate, but you don't have to talk to him in a baby voice. And it would make my mom laugh because she was like, I never thought it. My mom had 7 children. She's like, I never thought about it, right? And I'm like, look, I'm not trying to teach an OG something new. I'm just saying that I think it's important for us to think about, how the communication, he was saying full sentences very early on because I was encouraging people to talk to him in the same way they would talk to an adult, but just be mindful of the language that they were using. So cross-cultural communication to me is something that everyone can learn. As long as you are paying attention, as long as you are listening, you can see what people around you are doing and you can mimic that. And then if you pay attention too, they may also, in many cultures, you're the guest, they're going to do what you do. Meaning they want you to eat first. They're going to watch you and do what you do. And so because I've been to 6 continents now, I feel like I've learned a little bit from everyone that I've met, which makes it so fun, right? It's so fun to bring all this back and then think about how to incorporate it into our own discussions, negotiations, and also habits.
Is Antarctica the only continent you haven't been to yet? Are you going to go help the penguins negotiate?
Let me tell you about a negotiation I lost. I lost a negotiation with my husband. I wanted to go to Antarctica in March. And he said, why? Because we haven't been to 2 continents? And I said, yes. And he goes, then let's go to Australia.
Oh, that's not a loss. Australia's great. See, that's a...
No. We had a blast. I loved 2 weeks wasn't enough time. Australia is massive. It wasn't enough time. And so it definitely wasn't a loss. I just meant I had my heart set on going to Antarctica because there are only a few times of the year that one can go to Antarctica. That's what I mean. And so March would have been a good time to go. And then I had some friends who had last year in March. So I had their itinerary. So it was actually going to be plug and play, where instead we had to come up with the whole itinerary for Australia. But it was fun. It was beautiful. We went to the Great Barrier Reef. We did a lot of wonderful things there, and I had a blast. And then I'm hoping that now that there's one continent left, that when I bring this up next year, I'm going to win that in that negotiation.
Absolutely. So now turning to your recently released book, Negotiating While Black, what was your motivation for writing this book, and who is your targeted audience?
I'm so happy you asked that question, because I get that question a lot, I think in part because of the title of the book. What I want to tell you is there was so many things happening in my life. I had taken so many negotiation courses at the highest levels. I was teaching negotiations, and I'm a lifelong learner. And I think that one should always be learning. So I was teaching, I was still continuing to add to my information storage. And I just felt like I was reading the same information in all these negotiation books and in the classes that I was taking. And it was this copy me model, right? This model that basically said that I, fill in the blank, was successful doing it this way. And if you do what I did, then you will be successful too. And I recognize that I'm in the room with two men. And I'll tell you that most of the books and negotiations, as you know, are written by white men, right? And that's just a fact. And so I felt like I was always filling in the blanks for myself. I would say, okay, I can see how that will work for you, because the way that things still work is still quite a patriarchal society. And we know that privilege exists, among other things. And so how would that work if I walk into a room, I'm the only woman, I'm the only person of color, I'm the youngest person in the room, and there are all these implicit biases associated with those things and more. Right? How do I show up as myself and still be successful? And I knew I could do that because I was doing that every day, right? I was going into these rooms. I was changing the lunch culture in a negotiation where they tried to starve us out as a tactic, right? And so I wrote the book because I felt like, one, people were asking me for resources. I was teaching courses. They would say, additional resources, because everyone always wants to continue to read. And I would find myself saying, well, you can read a chapter of this, a little bit of that. You can watch this, but I wrote something that I think will help you because I've been in this class with you for X number of time, or you have things in common with me. Or I would ask a question. What are some pressure points or pain points that you're feeling in your negotiations? And what are you looking for? How can I help supplement that? And so I wanted more people to see themselves in a negotiations book, especially leaning into intersectionality of the reader, right? However you show up in the world, whatever boxes you check, I wanted people to see themselves in my book. I wanted people to know what to do if implicit bias was present. I felt like if bias was even mentioned in a negotiation book, it was in passing. Bias is something that can really impact a negotiation and the outcome. And so I wanted to take a deeper dive into how it was showing up and give people some tools to help navigate it. And then at the time that I wrote my proposal, that was in 2020. I started working on that in June 2020. At that time, a lot of things were happening, if you may recall. In May 2020, that was when the murder of George Floyd happened. Right around the same time, we were seeing the COVID-19 pandemic impact our world in a way that in my lifetime, I've never seen any disease, virus impact businesses, countries, actual global shutdowns. In New York, where I lived, we were quarantining, we were on lockdown, we couldn't leave. In the city that never sleeps, we were forced to shut doors. And then it was also another presidential election coming up, right? You're hearing a theme. There's presidential elections make me want to do something. Like we have to do something, you have to do something. And so I felt like at the time globally, there was this need where people were seeking more tools to learn how to negotiate in real life, right? Real life was happening and everyone could see it. And I wanted to do something that could help people improve their negotiations techniques and skills, because every day we're negotiating. It's not, again, something that happens just once in a while. Every day I'm negotiating with my kids for screen time. Every day I'm negotiating with a friend or a colleague. Every day I'm negotiating on behalf of a client. Every day as a mediator, I'm in the middle helping people to negotiate. right? And the altruistic part of me wanted to do my part to help make the world a better place. I told you I went to Howard University School of Law because I wanted to be a social engineer. I wanted to inspire people also to share their gifts and experiences with the world. And I really thought that we needed to move away from this one size fits all negotiation approach. We are not one size fits all people. So instead of having a book that says, do what I did, you'll be successful, instead, I tried to put toolkits at the end of each chapter so that just like right now, if you have a toolkit in your home, you would say, okay, I need to hang a painting on the wall. You're not going to go to the toolkit and take out, a monkey wrench or a sledgehammer. You're going to think about, okay, this has 2 hooks here. I'm going to take out the appropriate tool, and you're going to use it based on your judgment. And that's how I want people to use my book. I want people to think about what the right tool is for the situation that they're facing and to use their judgment, because the only constant in the negotiation that you are in is you. And so how do we empower people? How do I empower people to pull out the tools that they have within them already, which I call their superpowers or negotiation superpowers? How do I help you to reframe things that people may have said were negative about you and show you how those things are actually positive attributes so that you can expand your toolkit? And then how do I give you some tried and true techniques based on not just my experience, because Penguin Random House didn't want a book that was just my stories, right? Neither did Bonnie or Heligo. They wanted a book that was also backed by science and research. And so I wanted to put all those things together into a package for people to take away that they can be who they are, get what they want, and they could negotiate from a place of power.
Yeah, you just mentioned there that bias shows up every time, everywhere. And so would love to kind of dig in more about how to face both implicit and explicit bias, and if you can explain what both of these are and how they show up in negotiations.
An implicit bias is really a negative attitude, right? So oftentimes a person is not consciously aware that they have this bias, right? This is also called, subconscious or unconscious bias, rather. And so implicit biases are prejudice, right? It's prejudice against another person, and it infects one's behavior, one's judgment. The issue with implicit bias is that because it impacts behavior, judgment, attitudes, it can also block some of the things that we also need to use, like empathy, for example. So how can one be empathetic? This goes back to an earlier question. How come it's hard for people to sometimes show emotion or to lean into emotion? Well, sometimes a person can't be empathetic if there is an implicit bias that's blocking them, right? And so if there's an implicit bias that is this negative attitude that one's not aware of, that certain people do certain things, group of people do these types of things, then that might block the empathy we're told to use. Oftentimes, when people have very little in common, the deadlocks may be because of implicit biases, not just the other person's, but our own. And so I think that's how it shows up in negotiations. I think that not leaning into how implicit biases work does a disservice to anyone who's negotiating, because it's so real, and because people aren't aware of it, they may not be aware that they're showing it. I had someone say to me recently that they didn't understand why the word Black was on my book. And I thought that was interesting, because this very same person had started a women's group, and she understood why it was important to take out women, right? And to have a safe space for women to talk. But she didn't understand, because she was not Black, why it was important for me to have the word Black on my book. I'll tell you that I told you I had to negotiate every aspect of the book. Negotiating While Black is my original title. It's the original title that I had. Oftentimes when people buy books, they want to change the title. Everyone knows, they might change the title if you sell your book to a big publisher. They may have different ideas. It was very important to me that I kept that title for a variety of reasons. One, negotiation books typically have titles like, something positive and something that gives you a promise, right? Or tells you what to do or what not to do. I wanted to change that a little bit, because remember, I'm trying to tell you, change the model. I'm trying to say, abandon this one size fits all approach, abandon this copy me model. Let me share something about an experience that people are having, regardless of what box you check. And so to me, negotiating while Black was important, because for me, I wanted to share stories, Black stories. I wanted to share, because let me just be very clear. it's not just Black stories, and Black is not monolith. So I don't want people to think, oh, you have to be Black to read this book. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it was important for people to see that I'm sharing stories, and stories that aren't always typical stories that are being shown, because we always are saying, a lot of people are saying, oh, we want more authors, we want more diversity in terms of authors. Well, a couple of things. One, you have to have more authors share their stories. And two, when the books are out there, people have to buy the books, right? And so that's how you tell the market that people want to hear these stories. The market is showing that people want to hear the stories, that they want to read this book. And so the title was important to me, Negotiating While Black, because I wanted to share stories. Two, to many people, it might be negotiating while blank, right? So whatever box you check, I wanted you to see yourself in the stories. So all the stories aren't about what I consider to be an aspect of Black experience. There's stories that check different boxes, anything that you can think of. Women, for certain. There are a lot of stories about women, a lot of stories about younger people, a lot of stories about LGBTQ plus family. And so I wanted to make sure that people could see themselves. Two, the subtitle is also the original subtitle. Be who you are to get what you want. If for whatever reason you didn't see yourself in Negotiating While Black, do you want to get what you want by being who you are? I wanted people to see themselves in that too. And then finally, with the subtitle, also my original one, anyone who's ever been underestimated or misunderstood, I wanted people to see themselves in that. So if you have ever felt as if you are underestimated in a negotiation or misunderstood in a conversation, maybe it's because of bias. Maybe it's the bias on the other side. Maybe it's partially due to your bias. And how can we pull all of this together in a book that sits in two categories, in business and also in personal improvement? It was not easy. It was not easy.
I think you did a wonderful job. You've done a wonderful job with it. I love this focus. I'm going to go back to something you said. The only constant in every negotiation is you. You want people to see themselves in the book. And I really agree with your analysis that, negotiation is something we do every day, personal life as well as corporate. We need to see ourselves as showing up in that way. That probably changes how we do that. Can you say a little bit more? You mentioned superpowers. Why is it like when we show up as our authentic self or manage how the other party perceives us, why is that a superpower in negotiation?
Well, let me answer it from this perspective. If you're trying to be like someone else, then there's going to be something off about the way you communicate, right? There's something disingenuous because you're trying to follow someone else's script, right? I'm trying to be like this fill in the blank person, this partner, this mentor, the CEO, this president, whomever my manager, because this person gets things done. Everyone likes this person. So if I try to imitate that person, then maybe I too will have that success. Well, the world doesn't really work that way, especially if you don't look like that other person. You have nothing in common with that other person. And again, to be clear, I don't think that, one race, ethnicity group is monolith. I don't think that. And so I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that what's important to recognize is that because we're all different, when you tap into the richness of your differences and you bring that to the table. So I think it's very important that you tap into your own superpowers. And some of the things that I recognize as being superpowers are probably some things that people are familiar with. Of course, I usually ask the question, what is your superpower? And I hear, I'm a good listener. I'm observant. I'm really good at leading. I'm really good at distilling, chaos, whatever it is. Okay, so let's figure out how we can tap into your superpower every time you're negotiating, right? And even when something goes unplanned, something occurs that you are not anticipating, how do you prepare for that? Because to me, it's not just preparing for the negotiation or the conversation based on what you're going to say. You have to prepare to listen. You have to prepare to be, what if someone says something that is intentionally or unintentionally triggering, right? Earlier, we were talking about, and I focus mostly on implicit bias. I focus on the definition of implicit bias because I tend to believe most people know what bias is and what prejudice is directly. We know what words not to say. We oftentimes know what not to do. It's the unconscious behavior that we're not aware of, the implicit biases that tend to get us in trouble and we aren't aware of it. And then we have unintentionally committed an offense and we have to figure out how to fix it. And so I think when we're focusing on superpowers, one, ask yourself, what do I do well? What is it that I'm good at? Then ask yourself, what do people tell me that I'm good at? Because sometimes people see us differently than we see ourselves. And then I would say, what did someone tell you that you were not good at, that you're bad at? And how can we reframe that so that you could see it as a positive? I asked this question. I was a keynote speaker at a conference in Arizona a couple of months ago. And I asked this question to, it was a room of 150 people. And one person said, people tell me that I talk too much. And someone else said, well, people tell me that I'm too loyal. Well, can't we all see how talking too much, some people get paid to talk, right? Could be a positive, right? Or how being loyal could be a positive. So I just want people to expand how they're viewing superpowers and reframe so they can see some things that they may consider to be a negative or others consider to be a negative, or even culturally or in your society, people may say is a negative, maybe a superpower and another form. And how do we pull into those? How do we tap into those things in a negotiation so that we're always bringing ourselves, our authentic selves to the table, being thoughtful, and also thinking about how we could be triggered in a negotiation and how to prepare for that in advance.
Yeah, kind of in your book, you allude to information is also the currency of negotiation, probably just as important as knowing your superpowers. In your book, you call information power and the great equalizer. How do you advise people to pull information from their counterpart? And what is your advice for sharing information with your counterpart?
There's so many ways to try to pull information from a person, right? Of course, we can ask some questions, and I go into different ways that we can ask questions, from targeted questions, among others. I think it's really important to also think about how you get information that's not just pulling it from the person, because people can be elusive or secretive or private for a variety of reasons. Maybe there are things that they cannot share, especially if it's an attorney you're talking to. There's some attorney-client privilege there between them and their client. And maybe there are things that they can't or won't say for a variety of reasons. And so I think it's really important to know that information is power, and it is the great equalizer, because the more you know, the more you can do with that information. And I've seen people in negotiations, and I've represented clients who were perceived as the underdog, right? Because maybe their EBITDA was lower than the other companies or what have you. But because we had information, there was a way that we could actually show that we had more leverage. And to me, if you're in a negotiation, then you have some leverage. I think oftentimes people think, oh, the other person may be older, wiser, smarter, richer, et cetera. And so they are going to have more leverage. But if they are negotiating with you, I mean, because otherwise they would just tell you what to do. They would just dictate, right? You know, my 9-year-old is an amazing negotiator. He said to me yesterday, Mom, I know it's late, but one of his brother's friends is on playing the video game, and they just invited me, and I don't want to lose this opportunity. So do you think it's okay for me to play video games with them? I was like, man, that is good. You know, like, I don't want to deprive him of an opportunity. Like, you know,
Right.
so good. I said, I mean, it was such a good negotiation strategy. He tapped right into the word opportunity. I don't want to deprive my child. Knowledge is power. He should have been sleeping. He was playing video games for another 30 minutes. I wanted him to have that opportunity. But in all seriousness, to get information out of someone, I think what's really key is kind of figuring out, just like in comedy or in improv, you got to figure out where the boundaries are, where the borders are. And if you've ever watched a comedian, they're doing that very early on in their set, right? They may have a lot of material they're not using, and they're testing out audience to see like where they cringe, where they stop laughing, you know. And it sounds like a silly analogy, but it works because you're reacting real time to inputs, to stimulus in the moment, and you will be prepared. I know a lot of people are prepared for negotiations. You have all the information that you can, hopefully, that you can get your hands on. And then I think when you're listening to the other person, going back to the foundational 5 and trying to get information, if you think about it from trying to understand what they want and what they need, that can help you, because sometimes there's so much going on. It could be overwhelming. Build some momentum. I talk about this in my book, about how to get the momentum going with the questions where you really don't want to get the full answers. In the sense, there's a moment where you might be trying to lead them to a specific place. Different ways that you can get information from someone, depending on what the circumstances are or the situation is. But I think at the end of the day, what you want to go back to is, what do you need to know? Why do you need to know it? And then how are you going to use that information?
That's fantastic. And congrats to your son on his successful negotiation. You've clearly taught him well. Everything we've been discussing up to this point, I think, is highly relevant for any negotiator, regardless of context or background, anything else. As we get into our final few questions, Damali, I'd love to shift to specific examples and advice you would have for someone facing intense prejudice. Would you mind sharing what works effectively in these situations?
The first thing I'll say is I don't think there's one approach, right? That's kind of like my whole philosophy, is that there isn't one approach. And what that equates to in lawyer speak is it depends, right? The two words that people hate to hear, it depends. But what I will say is that it's really situational and it depends on the person. When you're facing extreme prejudice in different scenarios, it really depends. So in my book, I talk about facing extreme prejudice if it's coming from law enforcement, right? And what's interesting about that is it may feel like a departure from some of the other things that I'm saying, right? Because I'm saying, knowledge is power, information is power, but I don't think it's always helpful to show how much you know when you're negotiating, when your life may be on the line and you're facing some extreme prejudice, right? So I think it really depends. So if you're facing extreme prejudice, especially in a situation where one option that you have is to walk away, right? That's something that I think you have to consider. Neuroscience tells us that our brain is usually going into fight, flight, or freeze when there's a situation where, let's call it triggered. That's why one of the options is flight, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. One option is flight, to walk away, to remove yourself from the situation. Now, I don't mean in a negotiation just walk out of the room. That is a tactic and strategy that some people use. What I mean by that is sometimes it's helpful to reduce tensions and buy time, gather more information by being conflict avoidant for a moment, and then coming back and being more competitive. We're going back a little bit to some of the Thomas Kilmann 5 ways to respond to conflict. So I think that when you're extreme prejudice, you have to think through what your options are. So one, of course, is flight. Fight isn't just adversarial. Fight is also being smart and thinking 5 steps ahead. I always try to teach people, my children included, and people that I work with, and including myself, I try to be 5 steps ahead, right? I try to think of what the various outcomes are. So what is my goal for fighting, right? What do I want to accomplish? What do I need to accomplish in this moment? Am I trying to teach a lesson? Am I trying to be a role model for someone else who's looking, who may not know what to do if they're faced with extreme prejudice? Do I think, is it an attempt strategically on the other side to throw me off of my game so I can be focused on fighting prejudice instead of negotiating and getting what I need or what my clients need? And so the fight has to be, to me, thoughtful in terms of how you want to handle it if you're going to fight, and how you fight smart. And so again, it's not just, boxing or a physical fighting. Fighting could be the way that you think through how you're going to respond, react going forward. And then with freeze, what's interesting about freeze when there's extreme prejudice is I think it a little bit falls in the flight category, in the sense that you pause, you slow down. And I don't mean freeze and do nothing. I mean, stop, slow down, give your executive function an opportunity to re-engage, right? Where your amygdala is no longer hijacked and you can think and have cool, calm decision-making ability, and then decide what to do. So I can tell you, it's easier to talk about this with an example, right? I have been in situations where people have said and done things that showed extreme prejudice. And each of those situations, I handled them differently depending on where I was, what the stakes were, meaning, did I think in that moment that they were trying to get under my skin because they knew that I was a better negotiator than them, smarter than them? And then I had to also ask myself about any implicit biases that I had, that I may have been holding on to. Right? So do I think that what they're doing is coming from their own implicit bias, Or is it my assumption of their bias which makes what they're showing me as extreme prejudice hit different, right? It feels different.
Right.
So
Right.
I think in the moment, my tips for anyone who's experiencing extreme prejudice is, one, my judgment will never replace yours. That's why I'm giving tools, right? Two, slow things down to the extent that you can. Slow things down. Oftentimes I hear people saying what they would have, could have, or should have done, right? We all know the saying that hindsight is 20/20. Well, if you had one more minute to think, what would you have done, right? To not just react, but to think through how you're going to react. If you look at a lot of situations in the news, when we've seen the videos of people experiencing what I would call an extreme prejudice, look at how quickly things escalated in seconds, in minutes. And would someone have done differently if things were just slowed down a little bit to just think, okay, what should I do? What can I do now? What can I do later? And to be really, very extreme, how can I live to fight another day? Right. And so those are kind of my main points as, one, use your best judgment. Two, slow things down. Three, think. Think, what should you do? And if you're not the right person, think, what would Damali do? Or think, what would Jesus do? Whomever you need to think to insert that person. What would grandma do? Whoever it is, if you know that you're not the right person to say, what would blank do? Then try to channel whoever that is. And I've had that happen before. I've had people say, Damali, I was ready to do X, Y, and Z. And I paused and I thought, what would Damali say right now? And I used to have a blog called What Would Damali Do? So that's why it's kind of funny. But I just think, and don't get me wrong, I don't always make the best decisions, right? I don't want people to think that I'm just walking around, just floating, and no, I don't. I don't always make the best decisions, but I do try to stop and think as to the extent that I can, even if it's a second. I use a last technique I'll point out is breathing. If people say, how do I stop and think? Things are happening so fast. What do I do? Breathing exercise. I talk about a few different ones, even used by the Navy SEALs to sort of to recenter, to calm your body down, to give your brain a chance to think, I think is really important. So doing some 4x4 breathing or whatever type of breathing exercise that you could do will help you to make the best decision. But extreme prejudice, it happened to many people I know, including children, and it's a tough one. Because you may not know what to do. And even if you knew what to do, maybe you were preparing for the moment when it happens, you may be like, did this just happen? Did this actually just happen to me? There's a lot that goes into it. I wish I had an easy answer for that question. It depends.
Well, it depends. It's a good lawyer's answer. So much in there. You mentioned the SEALs, by the way, and it's in that community as we've done some work too. The idea of slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I hear that kind of in your response too, as you framed that out. Earlier, when you talked about kind of your upbringing and kind of being, learning not only what to advocate for, but how to advocate well. I want to just return to that for a second. How much does your advice around dealing with prejudice overlap with advice for how do I advocate well for my own beliefs, my own values, my own identity?
That's a great question. And I'll say that in terms of prejudice, what's interesting is that we're going through, I wouldn't say it's unprecedented because this sort of comes around in waves or cycles, but the current environment is one where diversity, equity, and inclusion is under attack. We've seen changes in the law that's kind of peeling back some of the progress that has been made with respect to just making sure there are more voices at the table. The reasons that some of these practices went into effect is because it was disproportionate. And now, there's an opportunity. I think now that's coming back. We're seeing things that are surprising to me, being an author, book bans. We're seeing education be impacted in a way that children and students aren't learning about some of the things that I think are helpful to know so that, we know the history so that we don't, make the same mistakes, so that we learn from history. And so in my own personal life, when dealing with advocating, something that I'll say is, what's very interesting is that in North America, my book has one title, and then internationally it has the other title. It is the same book. And what's interesting is how sometimes people gravitate towards one title over the other. It's kind of a social experiment, if you will.
Right.
And I shouldn't say it's the same book. There are a couple of things that have been changed. But when I say a couple, when I recorded it, it took me 20 minutes to make those changes. So that's to tell you, in a book that's 7 or 8 hours recorded, only 20 minutes of changes are different. And on paper, I think I only made 3 pages of changes, and that was including the questions that I was being asked to address in the international version. And so what I mentioned before, that it's important to have diversity in storytelling. I think that everyone is the griot of their story and should tell their stories. I think stories should not only reflect certain voices, they should reflect as many diverse voices as possible, because we are a multicultural society. So it only makes sense that you would hear from a variety of voices. And that's not, me just saying that because I'm a diverse person. I want to turn on the TV and see different people doing different things. I don't only want to see the same person or group of people. I want to read different stories. I want to know what's happening in different parts of the world. Right now, my son is reading a book, and I hope I say this the right way, but on the Iroquois, I believe it was a tribe of indigenous people. And I'm reading it too, because I was like, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard of people. And so I'm reading it too. And so I just think it's important to have different stories be told. When I think about advocacy, what am I advocating for? Well, I am working on 2 new books, right? And it's interesting about that is going from this book, which is doing very well, to the next 2 books and figuring out again what the market needs and what legacy I want to leave and how I want to help people. And how can I help people? And so everything kind of goes back to that for me. When I'm asking myself about any prejudice or bias that I'm experiencing, 1, I go back to the foundational 5. What do I want? What do I need? Am I listening to hear what the market needs? And how am I communicating it? And how do I know when it's done? When is it time to close and move on? Those are tenets that I live by, because that's how I can be grounded even in the face of bias. That's how I remember to get whatever it is that I want and I need, not just for myself, but for others that I'm advocating for. And even when I'm in the middle, when I'm the third party neutral, I'm also trying to figure out, getting past the positions that people are stating. What are their interests? What is it that they want? What is it that they need? How can I get them to hear each other, right? How can I improve the communication of what they need by me helping them to communicate it? And when is it time to wrap it up? It's something that is applicable to almost any situation, including my own advocacy, my own self-advocacy.
Right. I love that you have embraced this new identity as author, since you are working on 2 more books. We won't let the attorney completely disappear, I'm sure. What would you advise a person who has said or done something, perhaps unintentionally, that demonstrates a bias, likely implicit, that has triggered or offends the other person? So when you're on the other side, what's the advice there? And you can actually recognize it.
Well, this has happened to all of us, right? You guys too, right? Where we have said something or done something that unintentionally offended someone else. I devote a chapter to this on my book on how to recover from unintended offense. And I take a deeper dive there, but something that I think is important is what I call mind the gap, right? So oftentimes we may have an indication that something is off. It could be a micro expression. And so we might see on someone's face like something happened where they look momentarily surprised or affronted or angry or whatever it is. We may see it, but then the question is, what do we do with that, right? What do we do? And so if it happens in the moment, if possible, one thing you can do is to lean into it. Hey, what just happened? I noticed that there was like an expression that I found hard to read, and I don't know if it was something that I said or did. What just happened? In that moment, when it's fresh, they may tell you what it is. Oh, I was surprised when you said X because of Y. Or I thought you were going to say this, but you said that. Or, I'm sorry, it had nothing to do with you. I was thinking that I forgot to do X, Y, and Z at home, or I sent an email out that's still in my draft. I need to get to it. I'll never forget one time having a mediation. And in the mediation, we were sitting in the room and there was a person who kept looking at the clock on the wall. Now, for most people, if someone's looking at the clock on the wall, what does that mean? It likely means that they have somewhere else they want to be, or they don't want to be here, right? In this situation, I didn't just assume that was what was happening to that person. I asked the question, hey, I noticed that you were looking at the clock. Is everything okay? Right? What he said to me was, yes, everything's fine. It's just that you said we couldn't have our phones on during the mediation. And I have my car at a meter and I use my phone to set an alarm so that I know when to put money or the meter. So I keep looking at the clock because I don't want to get a ticket. Boom. Right? Now I have information. Information is power. So now I can say, oh, please, by all means, set your alarm. But let me just tell people in the room so that if it goes off, they don't think that the phone is ringing. Okay, is it possible to put it on vibrate? If you feel comfortable, tell me what time it is, and I can set an alarm so that it's not disruptive to the process. The reason that I don't want phones on is so that it's not disruptive to the process. So explaining my need for wanting to have the phones off. And so again, going back to the foundational 5. So what I think is really important is just sort of making sure a couple of things. And, you're right. I will always be an attorney. It's funny. Sometimes people say, I have to think about what hat I'm going to wear when someone calls me. Which hat do they want me to wear? Do they just want to vent? Do they want advice? Do they want me to mediate? What are they asking me for? But I think what's really important is when you commit an unintended offense, it's just thinking, did I notice something? There's something off. And I talk about chemical signals and things like that. There's a lot of research on how something in the atmosphere, which people might just consider to be vibes or energy if you're into that type of language. But the technical term is chemical signals, which can impact the environment and how one feels in the environment. So if someone's upset, that can then impact you if you walk into that space and you just kind of absorb that energy. So I say all this to say that there are different ways that you can recover. In the moment, if you notice it, mind the gap, ask a question, figure out what went wrong. If it's after the fact and you're trying to CSI it and forensically understand what went wrong, then something that you may want to do is try to figure it out. Like, what happened? Was it something I said? Was it something I did? Was it something someone else said and I should have picked up on it and I should have fixed it, right? Sometimes, we've all been in a situation where a client says something that maybe we wish that they shouldn't have said, and we try to find a way to fix it. Recovering from an unintended offense is, to me, like one of the greatest skills that I provide in the book, because it's happened to all of us. We can all try at least to fix it. We may not be able to fix it, but if we want to fix it, I give you sort of some tools to help you fix it.
That's great. This has been a powerful discussion. Thank you so much, Damali. As you prepare to conclude, what final thought would you like to leave with our listeners to help them as they become more effective negotiators?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think for listeners, the first thing is to recognize is that you are a negotiator. You negotiate every day. And sometimes if you don't see your power when you're negotiating for yourself, I want you to think about who you advocate for. Do you advocate for a friend, a family member? Do you advocate for animals? What do you value? What's important to you? What is your moral compass? And think about how you put your mind, your voice, your money behind that. I want you to know that you are a negotiator. You negotiate every day, and you're probably better at it than you think. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that bias is real. It happens every day, whether you are aware of it or not. You have bias. I have bias. We all have implicit bias. There are many ways to work through bias. One is being aware of it. And so I think it's very important to just recognize that and then prepare. The same way you prepare for your negotiations and discussions, prepare to be triggered. So for example, if you know that if someone says something that's condescending to you in a negotiation, be ready for it. Have a quip ready. There is a woman I worked with before. She was a senior partner. And I was personally there a couple of times when I saw clients who were senior men in their companies ask her to go get coffee. And some of the younger women who worked with her were always surprised. Like, oh, they're having this senior attorney go get coffee. And so one day we asked her, like, how come you don't see anything? How come you just go get the coffee? And she was like, oh, I'm so used to it. If they want to pay me at my rate to go get coffee, that's now no skin off of my back. If they want to pay me to do that, not a problem. So she had already, found a way to deal with it. She knew was going to happen, and she didn't let it impact her ability to be an exceptional attorney. And I learned that from her. Like, oh, someone might say something or do something that may be offensive to me, and how am I going to be prepared for it? I've had people say, oh, your hair is amazing. Can I touch it? I'm already ready. No, I don't think so. Like, I don't like people touching my hair, or I prefer that you don't. Like things like that, like just small things that for some people that could just throw them off. It's a real example, and it happens to a lot of people. But I think it's something to just show you, be prepared and have something at the ready that you can utilize. And then the last takeaway that I will leave is essentially this fact that there is no one size fits all approach. Okay. When you only try to follow one person's script, you are limiting yourself and the universe of potential negotiated outcomes, right? You want to take all of the opportunities that come to you. And if you try to follow this copy me model of negotiation, you are doing yourself a disservice, even if you check all the boxes of some of those writers of the other negotiation books. And so if there's one takeaway that you can take away from my book, it is that you can be who you are and you can get what you want, because the only constant in each of your negotiations is you.
Beautifully said, Damali, and thank you so much for taking the time. We've taken a little bit more of your time than we planned on, but I know that it's been valuable for us and certainly for our listeners. So thanks, and thanks for the insights, thanks for the stories, but most importantly, thanks for your time.
Thank you both. It's been a wonderful, wonderful discussion, and I'm really excited about NEGOTIATEx podcast and just having this time to speak with both of you.
Well, that is it for us on today's podcast. If you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode.